Hi, welcome everybody. My name is Linda Coady and I'm the Executive Director of the Pembina Institute. And I'm coming to you today from Vancouver, British Columbia, in the unceded traditional territories of the Musqueam, the Squamish, the Tsleil-Waututh First Nations, and we are grateful for their stewardship of these lands and waters. As many of you know, at the Pembina Institute, we're a nonprofit organization that advocates for strong, effective policies to support Canada's transition to a net zero economy. We are very pleased that you could join us today to discuss what a Biden-Harris administration could mean for the Canada-US relationship on climate and energy issues. And we're really pleased to have two special guests with us today from south of the border who are going to help us think through what some of the new opportunities and the constraints could be that will characterize that relationship. So first of all, I'd like to introduce you to Sarah Ladislaw. Sarah is the Senior VP Director and Senior Fellow of the Energy, Security and Climate Change Program at the Center for Strategics and International Studies in Washington, D.C. Sarah and her team lead the center's work on energy policy, regulation, and technology development. They track and analyze the geopolitics of climate and energy issues across several continents. Some of you may know Sarah from the Center's Energy 360 podcast, one I never miss, where she does a deep dive into the economics and politics of energy issues in North America and globally. And she interviews experts from around the world on the role of electricity and all sources of energy, oil, gas, renewables, biofuels, hydrogen, and nuclear in the transition to net zero emissions. And Sarah and her team have recently also entered into a new partnership with the International Climate Funds that is looking at the social and the human side of transition to a low carbon future and the importance of addressing disproportionate impacts and risks. So welcome, Sarah. I imagine things have been pretty busy in Washington, D.C. these past 2 weeks for your team.
Thanks for having me. Yeah, it's been busy. Some ways busier than we'd like it to be, but we're trying to keep pace with all the transitions going on here, or almost going on here in DC.
Okay, great. Mark Brownstein is the Senior Vice President of Energy at the U.S. Environmental Defense Fund based out of New York. He leads EDF's work on global energy policy, energy transition, and the future of oil and gas. As many of you know, for some time now, EDF has been leading the charge locally and globally on methane reduction. They've been behind the development of new satellite technology that can pinpoint even the smallest methane leaks from space. And they have been behind the development of a very compelling business case for methane reduction that demonstrates how companies can reduce their costs by reducing their emissions, something that there is now even widespread agreement on within US natural gas companies. At Pembina, we know Mark and his team from joint work we did a few years ago to get Canada, the US, and Mexico to adopt a shared target of 45% reduction in methane emissions by 2025 over 2012 levels. The US obviously dropped out of this triumvirate during the Trump era, but we will get Mark's views today on whether or not a North American collaboration on methane could get back on track and be a conduit for adoption of more ambitious targets for 2030 and 2040. Welcome, Mark, and a big congratulations on the news that EDF has just received a $100 million grant from the Jeff Bezos Earth Foundation to work on methane reduction and nature-based solutions to climate change. Mark, you're going to be the only environmental nonprofit that I know that can actually own its own satellite.
Well, it's an important project to take, Linda, the work that we've done together here in North America and really turn it into the kind of global campaign that it deserves to be. So I'm looking forward to the satellite playing an important role in our ongoing work together and our ability to spread that work elsewhere.
That's great. Okay, exciting times. So Mark and Sarah, just bear with me a bit here as I take a few minutes at the outset to set the scene for this discussion. So, as you know, we Canadians are long enough in tooth about our complex and intertwined relationship with our large neighbor to the south. that we don't ever expect it to be smooth sailing. But at the risk of understatement and to stay diplomatic about it, the last 4 years have been pretty tough. So to say that groups in Canada like the Pembina Institute are happy to have the US federal government back in the Paris Agreement would be an understatement. And I'm deliberately putting the emphasis here on the US federal government because we are well aware here in Canada of the fact that many American states and municipal governments never left the Paris Agreement. But the US absence at the federal level certainly cast a wide shadow, arguably created a 4-year gap that was felt globally and locally. So news of a Biden-Harris administration has sent a signal to the rest of the world that the pace is picking up here on the transition to a low carbon future, and that the US government will now be taking an all-government across the board approach to the challenges at hand. So meanwhile, here in Canada, the fact that our two countries will at the very least be rowing in the same direction again on our Paris goal of net zero emissions by 2050 is really welcome news to those of us working on that transition. Now, how good we can be at rowing together is what we really want to get your insights and advice on today. And how good we can be at that with the pandemic as a major factor here, driving uncertainty and making it hard to predict what will happen is obviously a tough call, but that won't stop us from trying to do that in this discussion today. So just as a general framework then to start with, when we at Pembina looked at the Biden-Harris climate plan, we saw 3 main tracks that we want to explore with you today. First of all, a policy and regulation track. Then secondly, an investment and incentive track involving government spending, maybe up to $2 trillion worth of government spending on clean energy and emissions reduction as a way of directing capital to innovation, workforce development and employment, and social equity and inclusion. So this is the track that is very much focused on achieving a carbon-free US electricity grid by 2035 and accelerating uptake on EVs and electrification of transportation, plus mobilizing government procurement and the private sector to at least match that 2 trillion as we understand it. And then the third track that we identified here that we want to talk to you about today is the international track that inserts climate and energy transition much more directly into foreign policy and trade on the US side as part of an effort for America to re-engage at the federal level on the global stage and to make the world move faster on emissions. And we suspect this track also reflects a US aspiration to take on China as being the world leader on clean tech for clean energy. So let's look at these opportunities for alignment and disconnect on these 3 tracks. And let's just start generally though with a first question on the election results. It was a lot closer than many of us Canadians thought it would be. The Democrats obviously won the White House, but they've not ended up with the seat totals they were hoping for in Congress, particularly in the Senate, which raises the specter of continued gridlock in Washington, D.C. So what impact will this have on the Biden-Harris plan for jobs and climate action?
Well, I'll kick off by saying that that yes, the election results were not the big blue wave that I think many had expected, the pollsters chief among them. And yet, you know, the Biden-Harris administration campaign ran on a very strong climate, was very much part of their platform. It was one of 3 things that they consistently talked about through the election, and they are now going to be the next administration with more votes for any presidential ticket in the history of the United States, and well over 5 million more votes than their opponents. And so there's every reason to think that the Biden-Harris administration will move forward with strong climate action. And in fact, that is what the majority of Americans, the overwhelming majority of Americans, are expecting. So that's the good news, right? Clearly, it will be a challenge. in some cases, because unlike in Canada, where you have parliamentary system, here, you have the possibility or the reality of a different party controlling the U.S. Senate. And so there may be limits to what can be accomplished through legislative action in the United States. But there's much that the administration can do through regulation, through executive orders, and frankly, through foreign relations that can make a huge difference for the United States, for North America, and for the world.
Yeah, and I would just add, I mean, I completely agree with everything Mark said. I think, it is important for all of us who do this, year in, year out, decade over decade, to recognize that, America remains a very divided place. But it was a very engaged electorate, right? I mean, that was a very high turnout. Joe Biden got the largest number of votes in the history of the country, and Donald Trump got the second. So a lot of people came out to vote. The election was about your belief about COVID and your belief about the economy. And there were a lot of other issues that voters cared about, but those two and the very different views that we have in this country over the importance of the virus, how the economy is doing writ large, were sort of the big sort of divisive points that we learned about in some of the exit polling, and that's kind of a broad generalization. We're still going to have to wait till January 5th to figure out the outcome of the runoff elections in Georgia, and that will determine control of the Senate, which will be important. But I think Mark's points about the fact that, one, it was unequivocally clear from the Biden administration or the Biden-Harris ticket that climate change, was one of, 3 central priorities that they plan to tackle. They haven't backed down on that a minute. It's something that was, part and parcel of building a better America. And we really not experienced that level of emphasis and attention to an issue like we have so far. So that means, that there's going to be, it's cliche to say it, but an all of government approach at this point to thinking about climate. And for those folks who remember the end of the Obama administration, they'll say, well, the Obama administration tried to use lots of regulatory tools and government tools to be able to enact their climate agenda as well, right? So won't it just look like that same divided government experience we had during the Obama administration? And I think a few things have changed, actually. The real economy as it is today relative to when it was when the Obama administration first started thinking about how to do things with climate is much more attuned to the fact that we're headed in a low carbon trajectory, right? Much more attuned to the fact that we're experiencing impacts from a changing climate in a more serious and more profound way on a local level. And so I actually think that there's just an enormous amount that a government, if they were thinking about using all of the tools at their disposal to incentivizing action, could elicit a much stronger response from the real economy, even short of some fairly major objectives. The last thing I'll say, though, is we have to keep in mind that the place the Biden administration campaign started out and where they ended fundamentally shifted because of COVID-19. COVID-19 isn't just a thing that happened on the way to the election box. It provides them an opportunity to place an argument for this $2 trillion of investment, for this remaking of the US economy. And I think even though that's going to be a hard thing for them to do with a Republican-controlled Congress, particularly if it's a Republican-controlled Senate, I think that this idea that you can say the T word, the trillions of dollars worth of investment, really comes from this idea that we have to recover and rebuild. I mean, it isn't a small thing to say that the U.S. economy experienced an economic hit from this virus that is on par with, if not greater than, what we experienced in the Great Depression. And the only thing that has kept us whole is our willingness to spend that amount of money. So I think there's going to be a pretty big fight to be able to say we have to make a really large down payment in the American future. So I think I've heard a lot of people sort of saying, well, that's going to be much smaller. It's not going to be as much going forward. I'm not willing to go there yet, because I do think there's a solid argument to be made that we need that kind of investment.
Okay, so I'm hearing from Mark and Sarah that all 3 tracks are live. So policy, regulation, investment incentives and foreign policy and the international track. So fasten your seatbelts, everybody. Okay, so let's dig in first on the alignment between Canada and the US on policy and regulation. So just as a reminder, right, we all know this, that the North American energy markets are characterized by a fair degree of integration, but our domestic energy systems are pretty different, with Canada's electrical grid already being mainly, not completely, but mainly carbon free, and with Canada being a major exporter of oil and gas, mainly to the US, although, you know, we've been trying to expand that market. So Canada's regulatory pathways on climate and our policy pathways have been characterized by a suite of policies that reflect these differences. And I should add that we strive for harmonization across various provincial and federal levels of government on climate policy, but we don't always achieve it. We keep trying, and we keep our Supreme Court fairly busy in the process over the disputes on this. But we just want to look generally at what the core policies are on climate that Canada has in place. And first, it's the adoption of the net zero goal. It's the standards and mandates for improved energy efficiency, further expansion of clean electrification by phasing out coal and growing renewable energy, carbon pricing up and running in Canada at the national level, as well as many provincial levels. Methane reduction, Mark, thank you very much for your help with that years ago. It keeps going. The clean fuel standard, a new piece of federal legislation now coming down the track. And then, of course, integrating climate, taking a cross-government approach to climate impact assessment and regulatory and project decision making. So also on our screen, like on the Biden-Harris campaign screen, is investment and incentives in clean tech, as well as financial regulation regarding better disclosure, new investment vehicles. Nature-based solutions are moving to the top of our policy list right now, and we're moving to make emissions reduction an integral part of economic recovery from the pandemic. So that's a quick snapshot of some of our core policies, many of which overlap with some of the policy statements in the Biden-Harris platform. What do you see as the top areas or the highest impact areas for collaboration potentially between Canada and the US in this policy and regulatory area?
Yeah, well, I'm going to go back to, Linda, something that we've been working on, as you said, for quite some time. I think one of the first things that the Biden administration can do to demonstrate that the United States is on a fundamentally different course, and one of the things necessary for the United States to do to reestablish its credibility in the global community on the issue of climate change, is to tackle oil and gas methane emissions. And I say that both because these emissions are incredibly powerful, driving 25% of the warming the planet's experiencing right now, and also because it's a relatively straightforward and easy thing to do that pays such huge dividends, both in terms of environmental performance, but frankly in terms of economic efficiency, that it's one of those things that you can do while you're ramping up your efforts on longer-term decarbonization. And this is a place where the United States and Canada have a history of partnering. And, you know, the agreement to mutually achieve a 40 to 45% reduction by 2025 is still there. I would hope that the Biden administration and, you know, President Biden's first phone call to your prime minister would immediately talk about the need to reinvigorate that partnership and work together to achieve that goal, which is now only 4 years really in the future. So that's the first thing on, I would think would be the first thing on the agenda. I think as time moves on, you'll see the Biden administration put a tremendous emphasis on electrification of transportation. And of course, the auto and truck market, as between the United States and Canada, is very well integrated. So this is another place where the two countries have a natural opportunity to cooperate. And of course, it takes advantage of the fact that Canada already has some of the lowest carbon electricity around. And so again, this becomes, I think, a tremendous opportunity. So those are two things right off the bat that I would look to see and want to encourage.
Yeah, and I think Marcus picked the good ones. I mean, I think I've always thought that just thinking about decarbonizing the electric power system and electrification at the same time were conversations that just didn't make any sense for the US and Canada to be having separately. I mean, there's just such a level of integration and opportunity and coordination that's necessary. And one of the things I'm particularly happy about in at least the conversations, leading up to the Biden administration is that there's been a huge focus on what needs to happen to the electric power sector, to the grid, to transmission infrastructure, to thinking about our electric power markets in the United States. I think there's going to be an enormous role for FERC and some big conversations about how we've structured the electric power sector in the United States and how we really open up opportunities for utilities and states to be able to do what they want to do in the first place, but we're going to have some hard conversations about infrastructure. And so that's a conversation that will likely need to happen with Canada as well. In the past, we've done joint modeling on some of these things. I think that that's, very good to do as well. I think, Mark alluded to this, but, the idea that in the Biden platform, it's not really just about changing infrastructure and reducing emissions. It is about creating jobs and opportunities and workforces. And again, there's just so much overlap between the United States and Canada in our workforces, in our economic opportunity zones, and how we can think about trying to build these things sort of, in partnership with one another, as opposed to just, taking a US only view to these things. Trade is likely to be one of those areas that is still kind of contentious between the United States and a lot of other countries, only because so much of our concern is about making sure that we embed domestic benefits from a lot of the investment that goes on here in the United States. There's no reason in my mind that the United States and Canada can't get on the same page in terms of environmental benefits and trade. And we've been having those conversations, even though not necessarily very positively, during the Trump administration. I think there's going to be a lot of, opportunity for the United States and Canada to think about what it really means to build a, largely decarbonized energy system, but take advantage of benefits in terms of hard infrastructure, the markets that we use, and the joint benefits that we might be able to get from thinking about that together. So that might be a little bit broad, but I think that there's an opening for us to talk about some of those things together.
Okay, so I'm hearing methane and clean electrification of transportation sort of being two of the top areas there, where if Canada and the US combined forces, we could make things move faster, maybe even globally between now and 2030. What about, there's a big conversation happening here in Canada around hydrogen, and we see it also happening in Europe, and I guess this falls into the the investment part of new technologies. What's the state of the conversation in the US around hydrogen?
Yeah, I'll jump in. So Mark, you don't always have to take the first swing, but the United States is kind of behind in its hydrogen conversation. If you look at what's been going on in Europe or Japan or even Australia, we don't have nearly as developed a conversation here. And if you look at the United States, we're going to go very heavy in CCUS or hydrogen, or probably a little bit of both. And so those are two areas where the US is going to need to move quite quickly. And if you think about, again, the infrastructure, the investment, the innovation that takes place to incentivize those things, Canada would be a natural partner in trying to not only think about that from the innovation standpoint, but how do you make sort of two co-located economies that have pretty developed oil and gas systems, pretty developed infrastructure to be able to do both CCUS and hydrogen. How do you really kickstart that? And so I think that's another area where we could spend a lot of time talking about what a partnership looks like.
And I would say along those lines, to the extent that natural gas has a long-term future in the North American energy mix. I think it's much more as part of a feedstock for producing hydrogen, and having that hydrogen then play a role in industrial decarbonization, in shipping, perhaps in aviation, and maybe to some extent in support of renewable electricity on the grid. I'm not a big fan of the idea of natural gas with CCUS on the power system, because I actually think the nature of the technology is such is that it's better kept in the industrial sector. And to have hydrogen be manufactured in the industrial sector and then used by the power sector in support of the variability of renewable energy. So I definitely think hydrogen plays a role. And of course, much of this also depends on how quickly we get to green hydrogen. And that also, I think, can play to a great strength of Canada, having so much renewable energy on your system already. And this may be a place where the United States and Canada work together with Europe. But I agree with Sarah, we're way behind in thinking about the role of hydrogen and having the systems in place to use it in an appropriate, responsible way.
Yeah. Well, we, if it's any consolation, we feel behind in it too. I was reading somewhere where Australia is already looking at exporting hydrogen to parts of Asia. So anyhow, just a lot of, I think hydrogen has come and gone on the energy agenda over the last 20 to 30 years. And those of us that have been around it for a while know that. But it seems to be making a big comeback right now. And it seems to be very intertwined into the discussion around recovery from the pandemic and accelerating emissions reduction. Sarah, did you have another comment you want to make on that?
I was just going to say that we were just looking at, the places where recovery dollars have been spent, and a lot of it has been spent on sort of sustaining existing industry, and then a lot of it has been spent on the auto industry and some other places. But you're right, hydrogen is one of those areas where a few countries have made some big bets and used this as an opportunity. So I just wanted to foot stomp what you just said.
Yeah, interesting. So, okay, so let's move to track 2 here, and I want to talk to you about that $2 trillion, and whether or not it's still going to get spent. I mean, the pundits seem to be saying that might be the toughest part of the Biden-Harris agenda to move forward, because it will require legislation in a Congress that will still have some divisions. So, but it was really one of the most exciting parts of the platform, right? It promised big, bold investment by government in infrastructure and technology, that would modernize aging grids and transportation systems while creating good paying jobs and reducing social and economic inequalities. So we all know the slogans here: Build Back Better, the Green New Deal, Green Stimulus, Resilient Recovery, digitize, decentralize, and decarbonize. Call it what you may. It's, as Sarah said at the outset, it's an ambitious strategy that aspires to use government spending to catalyze a lot more money into energy transition. So what's your take on the pieces of this really ambitious agenda that are going to be able to move forward and which are not? Is there any role that Canada can play in some of this?
Mark, you want to go?
I think this is one of those places where the outcome of the special elections in the Senate in Georgia will tell us more, maybe about what's possible. Clearly, there is a need for stimulus, but let's also be clear that for a lot of Americans, the need is very basic. You have folks in services industries who are out of work right now because people aren't going to bars and restaurants. You have, local movie theaters that are closed down. And so you can look, I think, very early on for Congress and the administration to take action to provide some basic level of support for those small businesses around the country who are really hurting as a consequence of what's going on here. And that's as it should be. But then you need to think about, where are we going from here? And what is it that's going to help restart the economy and generate, new jobs and economic development? And that's where we get into, I think, questions of where to put that next slug of investment. One of the things that is, I think, fundamentally true about Joe Biden is he is an infrastructure guy. Okay, this is the man who literally commuted from his office in Washington, D.C. to his house in Wilmington, Delaware every day by train. And so he understands infrastructure and the importance of good infrastructure, I think, in a very visceral, very personal way. And so I would put, I'd put money on the bet that what we're likely to see in the next couple of years is a real focus on infrastructure. And that is something that I think will enjoy a certain amount of bipartisan support. Outgoing President Trump talked about infrastructure, never was able to quite get it done. But there's support there for it. And so I would be thinking much more about, the Build Back Better in the context of what can the United States do with regard to infrastructure. And again, I think that may open up opportunities for Canada. I'm very mindful of where some of our train cars come from. And that's what I would be looking for, infrastructure.
Sarah?
Yeah, I agree with everything Mark said. I mean, I think a couple points to add to that. I don't think you'll see, as you would have had there been a clean sweep of both the Congress and the administration for Democrats, I don't think you'll see this described necessarily as a climate bill in that way. I think Mark is right. This is an infrastructure U.S. modernization type of endeavor should it get started. The thing that I'm pretty concerned about is, in our outlook for this stimulus package, it was always, the big question was, by the time you've spent, several $1 trillion, do you get to spend 2 more, right? And because most of what we've spent so far is really to address what Mark talked about, which is the sort of near-term impacts of people who are out of work and can't go to work, and businesses that need to shut down, or people who need to can't pay their rent or things like that. And we're actually in a really terrible situation here in the U.S. because we're not ready to continue spending what we call the stabilization stimulus. And if we don't do that, and the economic harm to the economy doesn't, we don't manage to stay afloat between now and, when the Biden administration stays in office, the harm can be much deeper. And that's a situation that's not good for anybody. I don't care, you're a climate hawk, as one of my colleagues put it, you're a climate hawk or you're a budget hawk. Like, this is not okay, deficit hawk, this is not okay for the US. So we need to make sure that we stabilize the economy from here to there. Then when we get to this position what Marsha is talking about, which is, so what's going to grow the United States economy? What's going to help people get reemployed? Where does that come from? And I think that is, it is a stimulus. It's a modernization program. If you look at all the things that we should be investing in, this is why, President Trump talked about it week over week. It was a running joke. Every week was infrastructure week here in Washington, except we never talked about infrastructure. And so, that continues to be true. I think there is bipartisan support. The way that Democrats and Republicans think about infrastructure can be very different. So I think there's going to be some hard conversations to be had there. The other pieces, and I don't know if it fits in a stimulus bill, but the other areas where we might be able to work together is on innovation, in particular, to the extent you think that innovation can also create, build back economic opportunity. That's another area where there's quite likely bipartisan support. I think we differ on dollar values, but when you talk about innovation in a US context now, it's not like it was several years ago, where it was really about sort of like basic R&D. It's really about developing new technologies, developing in the manufacturing capacity, thinking about, how you extract the value from the value chain of those technologies. So it's a different conversation that we're having on the Hill about innovation than it used to be, and it is a more jobs and economic opportunity oriented one. So I think that that's another important area where the U.S. and where the Biden administration and Congress could find some agreement. The two other things I just want to flag is I think the Biden administration, Biden campaign, I'm getting ahead of myself again, they have been very astute about building the coalitions they might need to get this package across, right? So when you think about the labor unions, the environmental justice communities, the states, I mean, they've really been working very hard to build a coalition of support. States are going to want more money. They're going to want to be able to do things. So I feel like that there may be additional support that they can bring to bear in these discussions that will be really important for hammering home that this investment is needed to create, good jobs and quality jobs. And the last thing I'll say is, we put a report earlier this year, called Race to the Top, which is fundamentally about what I call like the last bipartisan issue that we have in Washington, which is we're really concerned about competition vis-a-vis China. And so this idea that the United States is just going to take a hit to its economy and not try to reinvest or do something to try and compete with what we see as an increasingly competitive China just seems implausible to me. And so I think that there will be areas of opportunity to say, listen, the US can't take an economic hit like the one that we've experienced and not try to reinvest in the competitiveness of our own economy and sort of just let this be. And so there's a really big geopolitical impulse there that I think the US Congress might be responsive to, and that the Biden administration might be well able to sort of tap into to drive interest in spending some of this money.
Yeah, that's interesting. So opportunities for bipartisan, or sometimes we use the term here, trying to move to get to post-partisan support, are definitely there in the areas that you've mentioned. We see them here in Canada as well, because we face many of the same dilemmas around these issues in terms of the political polarization and, what are the strategies for pushing past them. So, well, speaking of political polarization, the next issue I have on my list to run by you here is the future of oil and gas. And so this is the sector that's obviously being reshaped right now by a number of dynamics that extend beyond Canada and the US. And they include geopolitics and price and trade wars with the Saudis and the Russians, and then changing market demand in terms of consumer expectations and products and services. And we're seeing European companies like Shell and BP already taking steps to pretty aggressively decarbonize and diversify their business models to meet with these new realities. But meanwhile, for quite some time now in Canada, you may have noticed we've had a heated debate going on over the role of oil and gas in the transition to net zero. And as you may have also noticed, it's tended to manifest itself in controversy over oil pipelines, and to the point where some of our governments have actually bought pipelines to ensure they get built. And we couldn't help but notice that you've got a similar debate going on in the US that manifested in the last presidential debate when Joe Biden talked about the need to transition off oil. Albeit for most of the campaign, the Biden camp was arguably more focused on converting the US grid to clean electricity and investing in the technologies that can decarbonize large industrial players. But anyhow, how do you see the US landscape on oil and gas issues unfolding under a Biden administration, and what are the implications for Canada? So inevitably, here is the question about the Keystone Pipeline. There's a tendency here in Canada right now to conflate the whole Canada-US relationship on energy into the fate of the Keystone, just one pipeline, the Keystone Pipeline. Many observers have commented on this, but it's obviously going to be a point of tension. But how can we, both countries, prevent it from distracting from maybe some of the bigger picture opportunities that are there for alignment?
I'll give a kind of a quicker answer, and then interested in what Mark has to say. I mean, I've been following Keystone Pipeline debate and U.S.-Canada relations on energy. It's what I used to do for the federal government when I worked at the U.S. Department of Energy for a very long time. And I think the best thing for both Canada and the United States to do is to have so much going on in the decarbonization side of the ledger that these issues are not nearly as important. Because as what you said, they're very contentious. They're contentious inside the Democratic Party. They're contentious between the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. They're contentious between, you know, the United States and Canada. They're just contentious. And I think that doesn't mean, I'm not saying, you know, don't deal with issues as they come up, but I think there's fundamentally two ways to look at it. One, you can get wrapped around an axle about things that are symbolically very important, and in terms of greenhouse gas emissions are actually important as well. But I think what we've seen since we first started this debate, particularly on the pipeline, is the real economy is moving, and we have all these really important, hard to do things that we can do to keep it moving in the right direction. And I would just really like to see the vast majority of effort being put on the side of making sure we're doing all these other things, right, that we've been talking about so far, and really putting some very serious down payments on that side of the ledger, so that when we have to talk about these other things, we can talk to the oil and gas industry on the basis that I increasingly talk to them in my work, which is they understand that there's a transition underway. They understand that they need to get about being part of that transition, and we need to figure out how to enable them to do that as best as possible. And yes, part of that does mean thinking about what does that mean for states that are still very reliant on oil and gas revenues, or provinces that are very reliant on oil and gas revenues. What does that mean about their economic diversification? What does it mean about the people that work in those industries? The worst thing that we can do is demonize those industries, not make investments in the future, and try and put them out of business, because that's what you can see in the Appalachian parts of the country in the United States, where we, you know, the perception is that the coal industry sort of transitioned away. A lot of jobs and a lot of opportunity were promised those regions, and none of it showed up, right? So I think that there's actually a very productive, forward-looking, forward momentum kind of way that we can deal with these issues. But I think it's really hard to make sure that you don't just sort of stay mired in conversations about the virtues of those industries. There's going to be plenty of people doing that, and I think that they should, and that's work that they should be doing. But I'm not sure, when you think about the role of the federal government and the relationship between the United States and Canada, there's so many positive, productive things that we can be doing that I think those are the ones that deserve the preponderance of the focus.
So let me pick up on those themes that Sarah put out. So first, let's recognize that in fact the world is changing, and it's changing in three basic ways. So the first is that you've got any number of countries committing to net zero carbon by 2050. The European Union, Japan, China itself now talking about net zero carbon by 2060. So clearly the issue of climate change and the issue to decarbonize economies is reaching a critical mass. And so that's fact number one. Fact number two is that 20 years ago, oil and gas had a monopoly, if you will, on their respective markets, right? If you wanted to go from point A to point B, chances are you needed a barrel of oil to do it. And if you wanted to heat your home or cook your food, chances are you needed, you know, a pipeline of gas or a canister of gas in order to do that. And what we're seeing is that new technologies have come into the marketplace now that challenge that hegemony. I can go from point A to point B now in a vehicle that's powered by electricity, that's derived from a wind and solar facility, that's actually cheaper to build and operate than any coal or natural gas plant ever was. And likewise, I can heat my home and cook my food with electric technologies that weren't particularly efficient or effective 20 years ago, but are now. And so oil and gas have to argue now for their place at the table. And in a society, in a world that's demanding cleaner energy, they have to be able to demonstrate that they can compete on clean. And that means addressing their methane emissions, and that means addressing their carbon emissions. And if they're not able to do those things, they're going to lose in a competitive landscape. And that's something that both US and Canada, as major oil and gas producers, need to recognize. And then, of course, the third piece of this is the simple fact that there is tremendous economic opportunity, as Sarah's pointing out, in redeveloping our industries towards these cleaner technologies. And so it's not simply a question of how do we hold on to what we had, but these are two countries that have always been marked by being on the cutting edge of what's next. And that is something that I think we need to go back to in terms of how we manage our economies and the relationships between the both of us.
Yeah, well, it'll be interesting to see how these tensions play out and whether or not each country is capable of keeping the bigger picture in mind, but those are good thoughts. Thank you. Just while we're on the issue of the border, let's just step back and think about trade more generally. So will the Canada-US border get thicker or thinner around climate and energy and clean tech? I mean, obviously, in theory, if we're rowing together towards net zero, there should be bigger market opportunities in both countries, right? And from the Canadian point of view, for renewable electricity, low carbon minerals and metals is another area of interest for us, clean tech, engineering, other services. And if we come back into continental alignment on the auto sector and zero emission vehicles and mandates and fuel standards, all the more opportunities for Canadian and US companies and entrepreneurs alike in these spaces. But at the same time, we're hearing some commentators warning that, you know, there's really not going to be that much difference between Trump's Make America Great Again and Biden's Buy America strategy. And as Sarah says, the reality is these economic and procurement strategies by the US government want to support US companies and create US jobs. So, you know, that'll mean the tone will be friendlier here and the market opportunities in some sectors will be bigger, but so will the competition, both at home and abroad. So any thoughts or advice on how we Canadians should navigate these new climate-related headwinds and tailwinds on trade with our neighbor to the south? And Biden mentioned border tax adjustments on carbon. Do you think they're going to come into the picture here? Sarah?
Well, Linda, a couple of things. So first of all, I think the emphasis is in fact on jobs. Right? So any Canadian company that wants to come down south of the border and employ Americans doing good things, I think is going to be welcome, right? Because it is very much about, I think it is very much about jobs, and it's very much about creating an economy that works for working men and women. So this is less about protecting market share for huge multinationals and much more about making sure that good jobs and good wages are available to Americans in America. So I think that's the first thing. I think the second thing is that I think there's so much more to be gained by Canada and the United States working together. The auto industry in North America is, you know, second to none, and in the auto industry and the truck industry faces a strategic inflection point now with new technology coming in and the need for electric vehicles coming in. I think it would be a real missed opportunity if Canada and the United States couldn't find a way to work together to realize that opportunity, because the competition isn't necessarily between the two of us. The competition is between, say, North America and China, or North America and Japan, or Korea, or Europe, and so we have a common interest, if you will, in making sure that collectively we earn the market share in that new transportation economy that we've enjoyed, you know, for the better part of 100 years, that we re-earn it with these new technologies. So I would expect the Biden administration to be very aware of that. which isn't to say that there won't be issues along the way. But I do think that this is an administration. I want to come back to this because I do think that this is one of the things that's going to be, I think, new and refreshing about this administration is that climate, clean energy, economic development is going to be at the heart of everything that this administration does. It's going to permeate how they think about foreign affairs. It's going to permeate how they think about domestic affairs. This is not going to be simply about, a group of greenies over here at the Environmental Protection Agency or a group of greenies in a corner of the Department of Energy writing good reports. This is really going to be, a mindset that is going to pervade this administration.
I just want to add 3 things really quickly to that because I agree with what Mark said. One is this is not a U.S. or Canadian phenomenon by any stretch of the imagination. I mean, we've got domestic circulation policy in China. We've got India with their own Buy India, Made in India provisions. Like, this is a change in the global trade environment. The idea that we need to reap more domestic gains from our own economic activity, protectionism, whatever you want to call it, I think we're at just an inflection point in the global trade conversation. The big question for us is, how do you make that one positive for climate, right? How can you, both reflect on what countries are saying about their need to better consider the way that we approach globalization, and how do we make that positive for climate? And so I think that's a bigger conversation that the Biden administration is going to need to be able to have. And I know that they've thought of. The second piece here is it's deeply important that the policies that incentivize moving to deep decarbonization and net zero or carbon-free electricity by 2035 actually incentivize that investment, because it's going to be very hard for a country that is generally long energy supply, which is the United States, that's not growing very fast because they've just experienced a recession, is to be able to catalyze that kind of investment and job creation and everything if we don't have those policies. And so if we do, well, shoot, then the question is going to be, can we ramp up fast enough to provide those jobs and that manufacturing here in the United States to meet that need? And here, I actually think the answer is going to be like, we're going to ramp up as fast as we can and buy some stuff from Canada and buy some stuff from other places. So really, and if you think we're not the only country in the world that's going to aspire to reaching net zero by 2050, and we all start actually not just setting targets, but implementing the steps to get there, well, the entire global capacity is going to need to increase relatively, quickly. So again, there's cascading steps here that are all required to make sure that, this job creation happens, this economic opportunity happens, and that doesn't run into trade frictions. So I think it's an area that's going to need to be watched and tracked very carefully. But I agree with the thrust of what Mark was saying about recognizing the opportunity side of it as being sort of central to how they're going to think. The Biden administration, at least, is going to think about how they pursue that agenda.
Yeah, no, it's something we're already watching with a lot of interest here. The Biden-Harris platform reliance on skills, jobs, social equality, diversity, and inclusion, right, to help broaden support for climate action, putting those things first. And then, by the way, the benefit here will also be climate action, has really registered here in Canada as something that we can probably learn from and and apply to our own plan to a larger extent here.
Well,
so,
and I think it goes. Well, Linda, let me just say, I think it goes both ways, actually. I mean, one of the things that we've been calling to attention to policymakers here in the U.S. is the provision in your stimulus bill that has money going to capping abandoned and orphaned wells, right? This is an opportunity to deal with a major existing and future environmental problem, but employ oil and gas workers doing stuff that they know how to do well, and helping to smooth the transition to what comes next by employing them to help fix problems that would render oil and gas communities to be, very uneconomic places to do business absent well remediation. So this is something that we think in the United States, we've been arguing the United States should be following your lead in that.
Well, that's good to hear, because that's a policy that the Pembina Institute has worked on for at least a decade. So we're very pleased to see it moving forward now. One last quick question. We're coming up to the hour here. The role of the financial services sector. Governments can't do this alone, whether it be Europe, Canada, or a Biden-Harris administration. They don't have enough money to accomplish this transition on their own. And a lot of the assumptions around the stimulus and the regulatory side here is that the right moves will bring the private sector to the table, maybe even with multipliers of up to 3 to 4 times, right? Through regulatory disclosure requirements on climate risk, new vehicles for investment, Mark, maybe a methane bond or methane asset offsets, or just greater use of ESG frameworks, right, for investment decision making. And here in Canada, the Institute for Sustainable Finance at Queen's University has even come up with a 10-year capital plan for achieving net zero that actually seems kind of doable. So do you see the private sector coming to the table here? And what are going to be the carrots and the sticks that are going to help them get there? Because we've got a big gap.
Well, first of all, just very quickly, money is not flowing to the oil and gas industry like it once was. So no matter how you feel about oil sands, or no matter how you feel about fracking, the simple fact is that capital is not investing in that anymore because it's not proving to be all that profitable for them. So there's capital out there looking for what's next and looking very closely at these clean energy opportunities as opportunities for what's next. And so some of the studies like what you've talked about are helping to point the way to where capital now goes next. One thing that I would expect to or hope to see out of a Biden-Harris administration is a tightening of restrictions on financial disclosures through the Securities and Exchange Commission. Companies really need to be reporting on financial risk associated with climate change so that investors, and when we talk about investors, we're not just talking about big institutional banks, we're also talking about the pension funds that you and I depend on for our retirement, right? Have the ability to see what their exposure is to risks associated with climate change, and can put money in those investments that give great returns, but without the risks associated with exposure to climate. So that's something that we're looking to see in the coming years.
Yep, completely agree with everything that Mark said, and I think that's going to be a pretty powerful tool for the Biden administration to be able to get U.S. companies to think this way. So one caveat, which I think is important, there's a huge number of activities that are trying to educate capital and investors and private companies about what their risk is, what kind of climate risk they bear, both physical impact and transition risk, and I think it's hugely important. You can't overestimate how important that is for both making people aware that that risk exists, and two, making capital smarter about, how to assess that risk. I think that there needs to be enough policy on the other side so that the clean energy opportunities that they can invest in are unambiguous opportunities, right? Because the one thing we have to be careful is, capital's not brave. We all talk about the financial sector like they're wizards, like they've collapsed the economy a few times. Thank you very much. So I do think what we need to do is make sure that they're given some pretty clear direction that green investment is going to be good for their future, and that takes policymakers. So we could, as one of my colleagues said, we could scare all the capital out of the oil and gas industry and they go to TikTok, and that doesn't help anybody. So we do need policy making on the other side that says, okay, and this clean energy opportunity is actually advantageous for climate risk, and you need to go and invest in those opportunities. So it's a hugely important thing, but we need to give it a lot of direction.
Okay, so a mixed approach here then. It sounds like good analogy, TikTok. Okay, so we're up to the end of the hour. Thank you very much. You've given us a lot to think about. We appreciate your time and your insights. In an era of deglobalization, how are Canada and the US going to row together on net zero between now and 2030 and beyond? And thank you, everybody who tuned in today. Remember, the Pembina Institute depends on your donations. Help us continue our work towards a clean energy future. Donate if you can. Thank you very much, everybody. Bye.
Thanks, Linda. Bye, Mark.
Thank you, Linda. Bye-bye.